With Donald Trump now in the White House, can the United States and Russia mend their strained relationship? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. From Syria to Crimea and Ukraine, relations between the United States and Russia hit a post-Cold War low during the Obama administration. But could that change? US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have made clear they would welcome a rapprochement. In a much-anticipated hour-long phone call, the two leaders spoke over the weekend. A Russian spokesman says a follow-up meeting is in the planning stages. So there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us here in Washington is Becker, an author and commentator. He also serves as executive director of the Answer Coalition. Nikolay Pakhomov is a global political consultant and analyst. He joins us from New York. And Anton Fedyashin teaches Russian and European history at American University right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Nikolay, let me start with you in New York. Relations between the United States and Russia started out well under President Obama. We remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton going and pushing that reset button, but they quickly nosedived. Why did relations deteriorate so badly, so quickly?
Hello. I think that answering your question, I think that maybe the main reason is that expectations were too high, and in the reality of world politics, the national interests matter, and difference between the national interests of Russia and the United States was and is still very significant. And in this situation, the only way forward is negotiations and understanding where these interests can coincide, when two countries can work together. But these efforts wasn't made during Obama presidency. We can argue why, and we can imagine that it could be done, but still it wasn't the case, and that's why the relations were so bad, I think. On the other hand, I don't think that there is any meaning in discussing why relations were bad. I think the most important discussion now if the relations can be better and what can be done for this.
All right, Brian, Nikolay talks about these two countries, United States and Russia, having national interests being very different, that they were going in different directions. How did Ukraine fit into this, and what happened there, the Russian involvement there? Was that sort of the turning point for relations in the country?
Well, certainly it was the turning point. There's no question. For Ukraine, Russia's historic second biggest ally, but the second biggest republic in the former USSR. There you have Putin and the Russians hosting the Sochi Olympic Games, and at the same time on their doorstep, the EU, and then directly Victoria Nuland from the State Department and John McCain and others going in and egging on the protests in Maidan. Finally, Yanukovych came to an agreement on February 21st, 2014 for a withdrawal of police from Maidan, that there would be new elections, there would be decentralized political power. In other words, an agreement between major players. Russia was there, the United States was there. The next day, an armed fascist coup d'etat overthrew the corrupt but democratically elected government of Yanukovych. And then the new government put into place and announced beforehand that the United States favored this or that politician, Yatsenyuk in particular. They said, well, you know what, our main priority is to take Ukraine into NATO on Russia's doorsteps. I mean, that's in complete violation of the agreement, the guarantee given by the United States and the West to Russia following the implosion of the Soviet Union.
Let me ask you this, Brian. If that was the point where relations really took a nosedive, was there any evidence that the United States was behind the coup in Ukraine?
Yes, because the next day, the day of the coup, all of the U.S. government officials, including the State Department, said, this is a new day for Ukraine. They celebrated it. They made an agreement with Yanukovych. The next day, Yanukovych is overthrown by armed militias, and the United States glibly, and I think recklessly, fecklessly, thoughtlessly, embraces and celebrates this, this can only be a message to Russia. We're behind it, we're behind the whole thing, and we're happy about it. And now Ukraine is being moved into an American sphere of influence on Russia's border, and we can see what's happened since. Civil war in Ukraine and an expansion of NATO war games on Russia's border. I mean, you can't be more provocative.
Anton, if we look ahead, now the United States has a new president, President Trump, who's been talking about improving relations with Russia. What are the priorities? They had an hour-long conversation, as we reported earlier on, over the weekend. What are the priorities for these two countries? What would they want to achieve in the initial stages?
Of all the things that Trump said during the election, his commitment to bettering relations with Russia was one of the few consistent points that he made throughout. It's my opinion that he actually meant it because it was so damaging to his campaign. The Democrats used it against him so efficiently, and he stuck to the message. He also stuck to the message fairly consistently, as has the Kremlin, that the battle against ISIS will take precedence in in becoming the nucleus around which Russia and the United States will forge their relationship. We'll see how that goes. From the Russian perspective, that makes perfect sense because that is the issue that the United States people, that the population understands most accurately. The issue of Ukraine is very distant for the U.S. population. It's not really on the front burner. ISIS is. Very little specifics came out of what was discussed on that phone call, and I suspect that because Trump has to overcome so much opposition on Capitol Hill and inside the Beltway in this attempt to renegotiate a rapprochement with Russia, I imagine that there's even more talking going on behind the scenes that we are not privy to and that's not been made public. But it looks like both sides certainly have the political will to move in that direction.
Well, here's a question. Why is there so much opposition to better relations with Russia, as you point out, in Congress as well as among Democrats in general?
Much of it has to do with stereotypes that come down to us from the Cold War and from this ingrained institutional and institutionalized opposition between the two countries. There's also been a very unfortunate trend in the United States whereby Russian specialists have sort of fallen out of favor and become very few and far in between. So the specialty of understanding Russian culture, understanding Russian history, to speak to what Brian mentioned, the 1,000-year-long connection between Russia and Ukraine, these things should have been foreseen by professionals who deal in that region. So that's part of the reason why the dialogue has broken down, and it really is an irony that Donald Trump, who doesn't have any direct connection to Russia, has emerged as a champion of a rapprochement with Moscow.
Right, because a lot of what the media was reporting here, well, not the media was reporting what politicians were saying. Well, a lot of politicians opposed to better relations were saying was that if you want better relations, if you want some kind of rapprochement with Russia, then you must be a Russian spy.
Well, unfortunately, that's a way to delegitimize any kind of attempt to restart the dialogue. The problem is that the policy implications of this kind of approach have led us nowhere, because that's been the story of the past 2.5 years, essentially, 3 years. So it's time to take a new track, and for people both in Moscow and in Washington, because there are hawks on both sides, to realize that dialogue is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intelligence and national self-confidence.
Okay, Nikolay, I mean, one of the things we did learn from that telephone conversation that took place over the weekend was that both sides want better relations. If relations improve, who benefits from that, or are they mutual benefits?
I think the only way and the right way to improvement of any relations between two countries, or for that matter, any number of countries, is when this improvement is mutually beneficial. And we, with all the history and being at the lowest point now, the U.S.-Russian relations are in a very difficult situation. And that's why I think that the task of improving these relations is very difficult. And that's why we can be optimistic, but cautiously optimistic. And the only way for relations to develop is to find ways and to find a formula to develop these relations in a way mutually beneficial to the United States and Russia.
Brian, there was a point during the election campaign when candidate Trump was talking about improving relations with Russia, and there was almost a hysterical reaction from parts of the United States media here. The New York Times said that he was a Manchurian candidate, not just the New York Times. The Huffington Post said that, Salon.com said that, Vanity Fair, Glossy Magazine said that. And it gets back to what Anton was saying earlier on. Is there a Cold War mentality here?
I think there's a Cold War consensus from which a mentality flows, and it informs the mainstream media. But what is the essence of this consensus? The foreign policy establishment now, Democrat and Republican alike, have decided 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Russia, since it's back on its feet, since it's a thermonuclear power, since it has and can exert its own national interests, is organically a blocking point or an obstacle for U.S. domination in key areas of the world. So you have organic, foundational, adversarial relations in the contest for the Arctic. That's where a new arms race is going on. Outer space. This is 50 years since the signing of the treaty ending nuclear weapons or banning nuclear weapons in outer space. That arms race is underway again. Missile defense shield. George W. Bush said a year after, he said, I looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes, I could see his soul, he was a good man. The next year, the United States canceled the anti-ballistic missile treaty, meaning that the U.S. was going to try to get military supremacy in the field of missile technology. We have a number of areas in which the United States, the military-industrial complex, is incentivized to push against what Russia must perceive as to be a threat to its own interests. And so the two sides, in spite of the leaders, Bush said he wanted a reset, Obama said a reset, now Trump says it, but organically, foundationally, institutionally, these two powers still will be, I believe, at loggerheads. So I would really emphasize the cautious rather than the optimism part of the formulation, because I think there's a lot going on.
That was going to be my question, actually. I mean, looking at that track record that you've just told us about, I mean, does Trump risk the same fate here?
I think very much so. I think Trump does want to have improved relations with Russia. I think he was sincere about that. But again, it's not just Trump, and it's not just a person or a politician. There is the military-industrial complex. The Pentagon wields enormous weight. They also need an adversary. Right now, Trump is saying, let's make China the adversary. That also creates a new contradiction for Trump, because Russia is not going to break from China. Russia is not going to break from Iran, the two countries that Trump is also targeting, China and Iran. So even though he says we want better relations with Russia, those positions, those foreign policy positions, flow directly in contradiction to really improved relations or a rapprochement.
Anton, can all three big powers, China, Russia, the United States, all have good relations, or is it a case of either or?
Well, look, it depends on who you ask. A realist would say that that's a false choice, a false question. It's not an issue of having good relations. It's an issue of finding common interests on certain questions and working together without needing to love each other or to understand each other. The Russians seem to be playing a very interesting geopolitical game. They prefer to regionalize certain conflicts, such as the Syrian one, because what we've seen happen over the past half a year, certainly over the past 3 months, is that the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians have taken the lead in settling the Syrian war, and the United States has found itself marginalized. President Trump bringing the U.S. back into the fight against ISIL will probably reinsert the United States into settling this conflict, and working together, only good can result. But that's going to be a very difficult relationship to manage. The Russians are also simultaneously playing a global game. Most people in Russia understand that Russia is not powerful enough to throw its weight around the way that the Chinese or the Americans are by themselves. Neither its economic, nor its demographic, nor its military clout is sufficient. But the Russians do understand that by throwing their weight onto the scale with the U.S. or with the Chinese will tip that balance. And Putin seems to be taking advantage of a fairly weak card, speaking globally, geopolitically, but he's playing it to the best of his abilities, because shifting Russia's weight and affecting the global balance that way is the best that the Russians can hope for if you're a realist and you think in those terms of global balances of power. And we'll see how it turns out. With Trump in the White House, it looks like the Russians may start tilting towards the US a little bit. We'll see what happens.